All right, here we are. This will be our final presentation, and it deals with sort of the third aspect of the shift from the Middle Ages into the early modern period. We've talked about the Renaissance, okay, and we have talked about the Reformation. Now we'll talk about the expansion of Europe. In particular, we'll talk about the European discovery of the so-called New World, which Europeans eventually named America, okay, basically the Western Hemisphere. Okay, um, this didn't come out of nowhere, all right? Once again, Columbus didn't go looking to discover America just because he thought it was a good idea, okay? It was based on trade, all right? And this was largely a result, well, largely. I mean, there is a demand in Europe for certain things, and this demand really got stimulated as the result of the Mongol Empire. All right, Genghis Khan conquered most of Asia, and they had this massive Asian empire, and so once you got in it, you could basically walk from one end of Asia to the other. You didn't, and it was pretty safe actually. You know, the Mongols didn't particularly mind people doing this. So you didn't have to pay lots of taxes for this privilege. And so what happens is that Europeans found that they could get to China over the so-called Silk Road, all right, which is perhaps better called the Spice Road, because that was really what Europeans were after. Europeans actually could make silk. The Chinese, of course, were masters at it. You could get some very nice silks in China. But what they're really after are the sort of spices that can only grow in certain microclimates in Asia. All right? This is the thing about plants. Some plants will pretty much grow anywhere temperate, okay, but other plants require very specific, elevation, climate, rainfall, temperature, all these sorts of things. And apparently spices are one of them. So pepper, cloves, nutmeg, all of these things, you can buy them in Asia and bring them back to Europe where you can sell them at a hefty profit. And people like them. They're used in preserving food. They're used in medicine. Um, According to their theory of humors, okay, if pepper is hot and dry, then you take it for diseases that cause the excess of the cold and wet humor, okay. It doesn't really work, but you know that, okay. Obviously, you cook them and serve them with your meal, okay, and if you had any kind of position to keep up, and you're giving, say, a banquet or something like that, you'd better have spices in your food because otherwise people will think that you are poor. So never underestimate status striving as a motive in history. All right. You've probably heard of Marco Polo. All right. He was a Venetian traveler. He got to Europe and he wrote about his experiences. Okay, but he was one of many Europeans to do that. Okay, and of course, we have to remember that it is the Silk Road by which the plague got to Europe as well. So that was a drawback of the Silk Road. The the Mongol Empire, of course, was huge. Eventually, it broke up, and then it started to be taken over by non-Mongols. And so, starting in the 14th century, the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks, rose and kind of took over Asia Minor and then into southeastern Europe. And they impeded the trade to Asia. You couldn't just traipse across the Ottoman Empire anymore. They would certainly make you pay through the nose for this privilege. So the prices of anything Asian went through the roof. And that led to a search for possible alternate routes to Asia. Okay? And if you can't, I mean, the obvious one is going to be over the sea. All right? If you can't go there over land, maybe you could sail there. All right? And no one had really done this before. This is a major project. It would entail going all the way around Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and then beyond that to Southeast Asia. But it is conceivable because there had been lots of developments in ship technology in the late Middle Ages on the Mediterranean. And people thought, well, maybe we can apply these to sailing out into the Atlantic. All right. And actually, to be honest, many of these advancements were Muslim in origin that the Europeans borrowed. Okay. But here are some of them. There's a ship there. It's the so-called caravel with what are called lateen sails. They're triangular sails. And you arrange them to take advantage of the wind, whichever direction it's blowing. And if you are clever, you can even tack against the wind. You can sail, not sail directly into the wind, but you can go sort of zigzag back and forth towards the wind. All right, so that's a very useful for navigation. Also a rudder, obviously, a kind of permanent steering oar in the back of a ship, which is surprising. The Romans didn't have rudders, believe it or not. It's amazing some of the things the Romans didn't have. They didn't have rudders. And so now you've got a rudder that'll help you to steer. And you always need to defend your ship against enemy ships. So if we can have a mounted cannon, that will keep other ships at bay. All right. Generally in Roman times, transport on the Mediterranean was done by galleys. Okay. I just saw Ben-Hur, right? Ben-Hur was sentenced to work on the galley. Okay, so he's one of many slaves who has to row these oars, and that you don't need sails if you've got a galley, right? You just row, and you don't even need a rudder. You just tell one side to stop rowing for a while, and that'll be how you can turn. Okay, and certainly if you beat the drum quickly, you can get going very fast if you're a galley. All right. So those are all advantages that galleys have over caravels. But the big disadvantage is that you got a lot of mouths to feed. So you can't. Your range is not very long if you've got a galley. A caravel, since you're using the wind, you can go a lot farther than that. You don't have as many mouths to feed. Okay, and the mounted cannon is going to keep the galleys at bay, right? So that's the thing. You have a caravel. You've developed this on the Mediterranean. You can then apply this to sailing out into the Atlantic. Okay, the astrolabe is another invention. Again, a Muslim invention. Okay, it's simply you can find your latitude using it. Okay, you line up the horizontal bar. You hold this round thing up in front of your face, sort of so that it's sticking out from your face. You line the horizontal bar with the horizon, and then you move the sight bar up to the sun when the sun is at its highest point in the sky. Okay, so local noon. All right, and that will measure how high the sun is in degrees off the horizon. And so knowing how high the sun is at noon on a particular day will reveal your latitude. Okay, so you have a chart that goes along with this. It's like a tax table. You figure out how high the sun is, you figure out what day of the year it is, and you can figure out your latitude. And this is useful if you're sailing out into the unknown. If you don't see any land on the horizon, you might need to know your latitude. So of course, what's the deal, right? If it is March 21st and the sun is directly overhead at noon, you are on the equator, right? And if it's September 21st, the same thing. If it's June 21st and the sun is directly overhead, you are 23.5 degrees north, right? That's the height of it. That's the tilt of the Earth's axis. So those are your two poles, and then obviously you're going to have a chart that illustrates everything between those two poles. Unfortunately, longitude is a lot more difficult to figure out. It's easy conceptually to figure out. They don't have the technology to do it. All you need to do is you need to set a clock going when you leave, and then there's going to be a greater and greater gap between local noon and your clock. Okay, the more you sail to the west. And so with every hour's difference, that's going to be 15 degrees, right? I think. Or five. Anyways, there's going to be a difference. The trouble is, of course, that you can't have a clock that works at sea. They only have pendulum clocks, and the waves are not going to make it work, right? The waves will screw up the swinging of the pendulum. So you cannot keep time at sea, not using the technology that they have. But at least you can figure out latitude. Okay, another thing, you've got the magnetic compass. Generally, you don't need a compass. You can figure out where north is using the North Star, right? You just take those last two stars on the Big Dipper and look up from that, and you see Polaris, which is permanently hanging out over the North Pole. Okay, well, you can't see that during the day, which is one problem. You can't see it when it's cloudy, which is another problem. And you can't see it if you go beneath the equator, right? Those are stars from the northern hemisphere, so you're not going to be able to tell direction if you ever get below the equator. Well, that's, of course, where the magnetic compass comes in. That takes advantage of the Earth's magnetic field to reveal magnetic north, which is not quite the same as true north, but you can easily figure out what the declination is. So that's another piece of technology that was developed on the Mediterranean. And there are others like the Traverse Board, okay, that'll tell you how far you've gone, and so on and so forth. All right. Now, it is the Portuguese who sort of took the lead in applying this medieval Mediterranean naval technology to sailing out into the Atlantic, which is easy enough because their country faces the Atlantic. But it was made into a national policy by King Henry the Navigator, who said, no, this is what we're going to do. This is going to be a national goal for us. We want to sail down the coast of Africa, and eventually we want to get to the Indies. And, anything we discover on the way, we're going to try to exploit. All right, so it's ultimately they want to get to Southeast Asia, but if they can trade for things along the way, they'll do that. And so, of course, that leads to, they weren't. These were voyages of conquest and exploitation. They were not sort of It's not like the voyage of the Starship Enterprise or anything like that. They weren't just exploratory. For instance, when they discovered all these islands in the Atlantic, the Azores, the Madeiras, and the Cape Verde Islands, um, they turned them into plantations, and they employed the locals there to work for them. All right. So anyway, on they went. Bartolomeo Diaz reached the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa in 1487, and then Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498. And here is a map illustrating this. Okay. There was, Albuquerque, New Mexico is named after Alfonso de Albuquerque, who came up with the idea that what we need to do is set up a chain of forts down the coast of Africa, up the other coast of Africa, and then in India, and then in Southeast Asia as well. We're going to set up, colonies, so to speak. They're not going to conquer land. They're just going to have a fort, and they're going to be growing crops outside the fort. And so what you can do is now you can sail from one fort to the other to get resupplied with fresh water and crops. All right, so this was going to be their chain to get. That's how they're going to get to Southeast Asia and back, using this chain of forts. Okay, so this is the Portuguese effort to get to Asia. It is only in this context that we can talk about Christopher Columbus. Now, he was Italian. In fact, he was Genoese. Genoa is sort of on the other side of Italy from Venice. Genoa also was, Venice was a famous trading city. Genoa wasn't far behind, okay? So they too engaged in a lot of maritime commerce, and Columbus grew up in the business. And he did a lot of sailing on the Mediterranean. He even sailed out to Iceland at one point. And at some point in his career, he became absolutely obsessed with sailing directly to Asia across what he called the Ocean Sea. All right? So they hadn't yet conceived of a Pacific Ocean, right? It's just the ocean. And they're going to sail out across what we would call the Atlantic, and eventually you'd get to Asia. And the issue, and I can't emphasize this enough, a lot of people, when they wanted to make Columbus into a hero, they wanted to run down the Middle Ages. Okay, Columbus represents modernity because Columbus believes the world is spherical. Those stupid, ignorant people in the Middle Ages thought that the world was flat and you couldn't sail too far off the globe, or you couldn't sail too far off the map before you fall off the edge. Okay, so that's the idea of what it was like in the Middle Ages. I can't emphasize this enough. That is simply not true. Everyone, from the ancient times all through the Middle Ages, everyone knew the world was spherical. Okay, and in fact, they had a pretty good idea about how big it was, all right, because a Hellenistic scientist had conducted a very clever experiment using shadows to figure out roughly how big the Earth was. Now, Columbus, as I say, he got it into his head that sailing to Asia was feasible. And he thought it was feasible because he thought the Earth was only about 8,000 miles around and not 25,000 miles around. Now, how he did this, why he did this, I don't know. Perhaps I think it really was a case of wishful thinking. He, once he got an idea into his head, no power on heaven and earth could dislodge it. All right. So that was his thing. Everyone laughed at him. Come on, Columbus, that is not feasible. Even the best ships we have, stuffed with supplies, You're not going to be able to make it to Asia before those supplies run out and you'll starve to death. But Columbus said, nope, nope, that's not true. Actually, the world is a lot smaller. Asia is essentially just over the horizon. Okay, but he can't just do this himself. He's going to need some sort of sponsorship. He's going to need some backing in order to get the ships and men and supplies that he needs for an expedition. Now, we're not so capitalist yet that he could set up a kind of limited liability company or anything like that. Instead, he sought royal sponsorship. He proposed he married into the Portuguese minor nobility, which gave him an in at the court of Portugal. He proposed this idea to Portugal, and they said, well, that's an interesting idea you've got there, Columbus, but we're happy with our efforts to go down the coast of Africa. We'll get to Asia eventually. This is what we're going to do. So as it happens, his wife had connections in Spain, and so he went to Spain, and he applied to the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella will you be interested? And Ferdinand and Isabella accepted his idea, okay? Because I think that they were a little bit nervous. Portugal is sort of the little pipsqueak country on the Iberian Peninsula. And they were kind of annoyed at how successful Portugal was being. Okay? That's sort of that's not in the natural order of things. Okay? The other thing is that in 1492, they managed to complete the Reconquista. What is the Reconquista? As you remember, in 711, Muslims took over Spain. And by 732, they were strong enough that they could invade France. And of course, Charles Martel beat them, and they went back beyond the Pyrenees Mountains. But Spain was Muslim. Actually, all of Iberia was Muslim throughout the Middle Ages. The Reconquista, that is the reconquest, was begun by Charlemagne, right? And so that's like the late 700s. It was finally completed in 1492. You see that at the bottom. Kingdom of Granada. That was the last Muslim kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. And it finally fell in 1492. You can see here that Christians are not necessarily united. Portugal is its own country, but Castile and Aragon were also separate countries. And why do we always talk about Ferdinand and Isabella being the monarchs of Spain? Well, one was the monarch of Castile and the other was the monarch of Aragon. And they got married. And so they united their two kingdoms. And then, with their super Spanish Union power, they turned to the south and they defeated Granada. So they were on top of the world. Like, clearly, God was favoring them. Clearly, God wanted them to succeed. All right? And so they figured, hey, why not? Maybe Columbus is right. Maybe the world really is only 8,000 miles around. Well, if he's wrong, we're only out 3 ships. But if he's right, the Portuguese are going to get that route too, and then we'll be really screwed. All right? Because you see, the Portuguese, they've discovered this route, and they're not going to let anyone else sail down Africa, right? They have established a presence there, and they're going to defend that route. So Castile and Aragon, now Spain, figure that, hey, let us establish our own route to Asia. We'll do an end run around Portugal. All right. And so here are reconstructions of Columbus's 3 ships. The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Okay. I don't want anyone saying that Columbus sailed on the Mayflower. All right, that's what the Pilgrims came over from England, hence the English name Mayflower. All right, so here are Columbus's 3 ships, and he sailed out, and lucky for him, there was another continent in the way. Really, I mean, the world really is 25,000 miles around, and no one would ever have heard from Columbus or these 3 ships again if North America, well, if the Americas weren't in the way. So Columbus was thrilled to have struck land. All right. He spent about a month in the Caribbean. He probably landed in the Bahamas. He returned to Spain and described what he had found in glowing terms. All right, this is a sort of a paradise. Okay, beautiful climate. Things just grow right out of the ground. You can bend down and pick gold up, which is just lying around. The natives are very friendly. They're very keen to work for us. They're very interested in Christianity. Okay, and Asia's right around the corner. Okay, Asia is right around the corner. But in the meantime, we can do to these islands what the Portuguese did with the Azores and the Madeiras, okay? And that is that we can colonize them. We can put these natives to work growing our crops. We can put them to work digging gold under the ground. And then we can also convert them to Christianity and save their souls. And so Columbus returned in 1493, a much better provisioned second voyage with about 25 ships, all right, and vice-regal powers, okay, so he spoke with the voice of the king and the queen as the ruler of this new colonial enterprise in the Caribbean. And of course, the whole point was this was just a jumping off point to Asia. Okay, this was in the back of Columbus's mind the whole time. This is just a preliminary for getting to Asia. All right. Now Columbus, as I hope I've made clear, kind of succeeded by fluke. All right. He only succeeded by accident. The world really is 25,000 miles around. If the New World wasn't in the way, he would have died. We'd never have heard from him again. But he went to his death thinking that Asia was right around the corner. All right. He insisted that we just have to keep on going. As you can probably imagine, people like this, they're not fun to work for, okay? He was a monomaniac. He had this idea in his head, and nothing could change his mind, okay? Well, as that might suggest, he doesn't have the ability to, he's not very flexible, all right? And he's always right, okay? He's always right, and everyone else is wrong, all right? Even when he's just a complete idiot, no, it's not my fault. So he mismanaged his supplies, he mismanaged his men. It was a terrible situation, and eventually the Spanish relieved him of his command and put more competent people in charge. This was not Asia. They knew from a pretty early time that this is not anything that anyone had considered before, that this is a new discovery. Asia, well, maybe eventually someday we can sail to Asia. And indeed, the Spanish eventually had these trans-Pacific explorations, right? They would collect things in the Philippines and send them back to the Pacific to Panama, where they would transport them overland and then sail them back to Spain that way. That's a long time in the future, all right? This is a new thing. It's going to be its own thing. And Columbus is not going to be in charge of it because he is such a flake, basically. One thing that comes out of this is the Treaty of Tordesillas, okay, of 1494, which was brokered by the Pope between Spain and Portugal. They essentially drew a line down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and the Pope recognized Portugal's right to everything to the east of that line and Spain's right to everything to the west of that line. Now, apparently this is why Portugal got Brazil, okay? No one knew how quite far to the east Brazil went. And so when they finally figured out the line of longitude, Portugal could lay claim to Brazil. All right? Okay, so how to put this? Spanish colonialism. All right? As you're probably, as you probably can imagine, however friendly the contact between the Spanish and the natives initially was, the natives didn't really play the role assigned to them by Columbus or by any of the Europeans. I mean, putting them to work in your mine. Like, who would do this voluntarily? I mean, really, this is a euphemism for slavery. That's what that was the role that the Spanish had for these people. All right? And if the natives objected, if they fought back, the Spanish would fight also. And generally the Spanish tended to win because they had superior military technology. All right? They had guns, they had steel, they had dogs of war, all right? Dogs that would be trained to attack. The Indians didn't have these sorts of weapons, all right? Even though they have home field advantage, all right? And after the battle, after the decimation, then that was sort of proof to the Spanish as well as to the natives that God was on the side of the Spanish. Our God is stronger than your gods, and so you are going to be grouped together into these sort of peasant villages. You're going to provide labor for us, and don't worry, we'll save your souls. You get a church and a priest to minister to your spiritual needs. All right? So, it's, in a way, the Spanish weren't doing anything different than what they were familiar with back in Spain. Obviously, in Spain, there's a class system, there's the nobility, and there's the peasantry that does all the labor. And so when the Spanish come to the New World, that's their vision for the natives. They see them as the parallel peasants. Still doesn't necessarily make it right, but that was their worldview, okay? And I think the fact that they weren't Christian, okay, you can kind of do what you want with people who aren't Christians. If they do accept your religion, though, unfortunately, it doesn't really change their status. All right, so this, of course, is a very touchy subject, isn't it? And there are some people who consider the Spanish to be uniquely cruel and oppressive colonial overlords. All right, this is known as La Leyenda Negra, the black legend of Spanish colonialism. And if you want to read an account of it at its absolute worst, read Bartolomé de las Casas, who wrote a short account of the destruction of the Indies. Okay, Las Casas was a Dominican priest who was sent out to convert the natives. And he came fairly idealistically, okay? And he was absolutely appalled at the way the Spanish were treating the natives. And he said, how can I convert anyone to a Christianity when we're treating them so badly? All right? It's very interesting. Missionaries are often seen as the propaganda arm of Western colonialism. Missionaries are the sort of people who say, God wants you to obey. God hath placed the Europeans over you, and your job is to obey. Sometimes that happens. But other times, missionaries go native, and they side with the natives against their own people. And if you want an interesting portrayal of that, there's a wonderful movie called The Mission, it takes place in South America. It's set in South America in the 17th century. It's got Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro in it. They both go native against their own people. And so Las Casas was one of those. And when he gets back to Europe, he writes this short account of the destruction of the Indies, which really the Spanish did to the natives. Lately, people have questioned Las Casas. They claim that he may have been biased. Okay, he may have exaggerated some of the things that the Spanish did. The other thing that he had a really outsized influence because by the 1960s, Europe, of course, is divided between Protestant and anything negative about Catholics was seized upon by Protestants and really played. So the question is, Catholics may have lied, and he may have achieved a reputation that he didn't particularly deserve. Perhaps better is to think in terms of the times. Okay, any worse than the French or the British or the Portuguese? Because of course, after the Reformation, right? No one's, especially if you're Protestant, you don't going to listen to the Pope. So all these other European countries get in on the act, okay? Well, France remains Catholic, but that doesn't prevent them from trying to establish colonies in the New World, and the British follow along. And the Dutch, of course, get in on the act. Were any of these other groups as bad as the Spanish? That's the real question you have to ask. And the other question is, were the Spanish any worse than the natives were to each other? Okay, and that's the thing. It was a tough time. There's no universal human rights. Natives are divided into tribes, and it's my tribe right or wrong, and you can pretty much do whatever you want to the opposing tribe. And of course, the sort of the ne plus ultra of that is this Aztec practice of human sacrifice, where the Aztec has established an empire in Mexico, and the job of subject peoples is to provide human tribute, which can be sacrificed on a daily basis so that the sun can come up. So yeah, I mean, the Spanish were bad, but it was a bad time. Perhaps it's best to think in terms of here you've got two ecosystems that had been kept apart from each other for millions of years, and now you can have goods and species flowing from one to the other. It's safe to say that Europe got the better part of this particular deal. All right. Certainly there is gold, and in Mexico, silver that they could dig up and send back to Europe. So for the early 16th century, Spain is on top of the world. Spain is all of a sudden extremely wealthy. And of course, once you have the influx of all this gold and silver into the European economy, it's going to spur inflation. All right. It's like printing lots of money. Okay, you've got more money chasing the same amount of goods. So that worked against Spain in the long run, because Spain, they were still quite medieval in their mindset. And they didn't believe, aristocrats, for instance, didn't believe in amassing capital to invest in some project. They just believed, well, this is going to support my lifestyle. All right. So Spain does very well, but ultimately Spain is overtaken by other European countries. All right. Perhaps the most significant of all. Well, no, I can't say that. Okay, but it's very significant. Okay. Native Americans practiced agriculture, and they domesticated those species that were native to the New World. Okay? So, what we call corn, all right, corn on the cob, various squashes, tomatoes, potatoes, and certain peppers. They are all the products of New World agriculture, whether it's in North America or Central America or South America, right? Eventually, these foodstuffs all make it to Europe, and they're not like spices, okay? These things will grow pretty much anywhere, all right? And so that really enriches the European diet. And, just you have more food means that you have more people surviving to adulthood, meaning that you have a population rise, okay? And so, where are those people going to go? Well, they're going to come to the New World and other European colonies, all right? So it's kind of a self-reinforcing here. The danger, of course, is when, you probably know about the Irish potato famine, right? Potatoes, especially these root crops, they're tasty, and you pack a lot of calories into a small package, and you can feed, pretty much the entire island of Ireland was being fed on potatoes. 8 million people living almost exclusively on potatoes, which is, well, that's great until a blight destroys the potato crop. Then you're in a very serious situation. So again, there are Malthusian problems with introducing food because the population rises to meet it, and you're no better off than you were before. But for a while, the European diet does get richer and tastier. Now, what about in the other direction? There are some domesticated animals from the old world that make it to the new. All right, so the horse it comes to the New World, and Native Americans adopt the horse, particularly the Plains Indians. Already talked about large dogs. Cats come over. Various other animals that are brought over. But this is the most significant, okay? This is the most significant and the most destructive living thing that is brought over to the New World. No one is really aware of it, all right? They don't have the microbial theory of disease. But Europeans bring disease with them, whether it's smallpox, swine influenza, or other sorts of diseases, all right? And the microbes that basically Native Americans have no immunity to them, all right? Europeans, over time, have built up not immunity, but certainly resistance to these various microbes, whether bacteria or viruses. And so they have if they get sick, they have a good chance of surviving, all right? But that was not an advantage that Indians enjoyed, okay? Indian immune systems were more geared towards parasites than microbes. And it is estimated that some 90% of the pre-Columbian population of the New World died as a result of contact with Europeans. Apparently, syphilis is the one disease that went in the other direction, okay? But no one is quite sure about that. There's still a debate in the air. All right. So, and in fairness, right, as I say, they don't know about microbes. All right. As far as they're concerned, yeah, this is God's will. God has clearly given them this land and he's depopulating it for them. All right. The next point there is even less excusable, right? You've killed off all the natives that you were hoping to work for you. What are you going to do? Well, you're not going to do the work yourself, obviously. So how about we just go to Africa and enslave a bunch of people there and bring them over? Because they're tall and they're strong and they do tend to be hardy against European disease. In fact, the reason why the Europeans colonized the New World before they colonized Africa is precisely on account of disease. Okay, natives were susceptible to European disease, but Europeans are susceptible to African disease. All right, but so that's one example of these African slaves. They're going to be hardier against European disease. We can bring them over to the Caribbean, have them working on our sugar plantations, okay? And of course, we're all familiar with the history of this, right? Uh, yeah, and there was, they basically invent racism in order to justify this system. And just because you get rid of slavery doesn't mean you get rid of racism. So, how do we view Columbus? All right. Here are sort of two poles in how we view Columbus. In 1892, that's the 400th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage, Columbus is cast as a great hero. And in celebration, there's something called the World's Columbian Exposition, held in Chicago in 1892. And there's the grounds for that. Columbus is cast as a great hero. He was a great visionary. He had the courage to go out and make something of himself. And yeah, way to go, Columbus. And certainly, if you're like a robber baron of that era, you look back on Columbus as like, yeah, he did what I'm doing. I'm established a railroad monopoly, or I established a monopoly over oil production. Just like Columbus, he was a great captain of industry before his time. More recently, obviously, we don't tend to think in these terms. In fact, we do tend to pay attention to those natives who were enslaved and slaughtered, and to the Africans who were brought over to replace those people. All right? So there are a lot of cities in America that don't celebrate Columbus Day anymore, right? It's Native Peoples Day, right? To celebrate Columbus, what's next? Are we going to celebrate Hitler's birthday? Are we gonna celebrate people like this? All right. In fact, in 1992 was the 500th anniversary, and I was a college student at the time, and you were supposed to dress all in black with a red armband on Columbus Day. That's how we were going to celebrate the 500th anniversary. Well, obviously these are two poles in how we view Columbus. I'm not going to tell you which one to take. All right. Obviously, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. And let's keep it. Maybe this is the refuge of a scoundrel, but I do think we need to pay attention to the times that Columbus lived in. His worldview is not our worldview. All right. He was sort of a religious zealot who, without any knowledge of microbial theory of disease. It was a tough world in Spain. It was also a tough world in the New World. Perhaps it's best simply to think in terms of, if it wasn't Columbus, it probably would have been someone else within 50 years. Okay, it's simply because the Europeans had the technology to sail far distances into the ocean. They were in competition with each other, okay, to outdo each other. All right, so that was a major spur, and they were capitalist, and so they were always looking for opportunities to exploit. And again, whichever European discovered the New World would probably have brought those diseases over. It's just a very sad situation in world history. So we hope, especially at this time, that we continue to be able to make antibiotics and vaccines against these microbes. Let us hope that we continue to be able to do this and that our ability to do that doesn't ever give out. So if that's one lesson of history that I'll leave with you. Okay. And so that will be it for this course. I hope that you have enjoyed it. Stay tuned for details about the final exam.